We saw last September his presentation as being the kickoff to that, his presentation on World War I. And I hope that tonight I could be half as successful in exposing some big ideas about John Brown and be essentially the setup man for the ACE that comes in May. I need to say a couple of things before we begin. I need to beg your patience and possibly your forgiveness. Typically, when I teach the topic of John Brown, in the ideal, I spend 5 full days in class with about 5 to 6 hours of reading at night. And the last time, one night total, 5, whatever, all right? But what happens is this, the last time I did that fully was about 4 or 5 years ago. I've continued to read on this topic since. And when Todd asked me, I got nervous and read more. So I've got about 60 to 65 minutes that I want to talk to cram in about what should be done in about 10 hours. So you're going to have to beg forgiveness, or I beg forgiveness of you. Secondly, the way that I teach, I like to try and address big ideas. And to a great degree, I don't work linearly or chronologically. So I need you to be patient with that and to understand, go with me, that the wave will hit the beach and hopefully it won't be a wipeout. What we're going to do here is 6 parts here. We want to look at intro and ethics, central memory of Brown, Harpers Ferry. You can see it's not chronological. We go boom right into his death. And then we go back to things about how we were contested and invented meanings, what I will call the fall and the resurrection, and then realities in its plural, and then to us. So if we can go with a sense of the big ideas, what I would like you to do is, some of you did look, but on the back side of the yellow sheet, please look at the ethical questions. I'm going to give you a minute as I start to play the song that was playing earlier, all right? Take a minute to finish those, look at those. If you don't have one, find a friend. Folks back here, if you want to see what we're doing. Okay, I made only 100. I didn't know there'd be this many. Okay, well, I realize if you just started it, but the intent was sort of as a simulation of a homework assignment for kids to think about. But let's begin with the first question. Let's start with this. Let me see. I'm going to pick on somebody that I know. Anya. Thank you. Okay. Anya, who do you select as the person you respect the most?
That I respect the most?
Yes.
Is this the answer that I'm going to give?
Yes.
Or you want me to give?
No, I want you to give the answer you want to give.
Okay. Person I respect the most, Mother Teresa.
Okay. How many had Mother Teresa as the one they respected the most? So you've got a pretty good support system here, Anya. Why?
I mean, there's not really anything that the woman's done wrong. She's dedicated her
Okay, all right, helping people. What's the other thing that we really, truly respect about Mother Teresa? Okay, that she personally sacrificed. She went and lived with the poor, not just simply ministered in actions of comfort for the poor. She was a direct colleague there. Wonderful, all right? Who's the best model for us? Haley.
Model?
Yeah.
I think that Mother Teresa, we like to think of her as relatable because she, reached out. But I think that Bill Gates is the most, modern. He donated money, we donated money.
Right. So I think with Gates, one of the things that we understand is that this person who built an empire was willing to give back, and that wonderful $24 billion that he first gave, and then the continued donations to that. All right. Anyone pick Norman Borlaug? Raise your hand. Okay, and why, sir?
Just because I have a lot of respect for him applying his knowledge and scientific know-how to better the world.
Exactly right. He took his skill set, pursued his own individual interests for not only a greater, but a great good, right? Something that was perhaps not just millions, but as I suggest, billion lives saved. All right. So we understand this as valuable stuff. How about in the second set between Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and Malcolm X? Did anyone choose Malcolm X? Okay, we have one. Is there a reason for that, sir?
He was strong enough to change.
Okay. An evolutionary element there. Good. Could you say the same thing about King with that? Yeah. Especially, it's interesting because the great film that's out now may be the capstone of King's life, but we forget the last 3 years where he becomes what some would call a radical. All right? All right, let's move on then down to the trolley question. Show of hands. Who would not have pulled the lever? Okay. Josh, why?
I mean, it's the greatest good for the greatest number being the fact that you don't know who you're saving.
Great. A utilitarian concept, the greatest good for the greatest number. I think that's what most of you would have agreed with. Would anyone have refused to pull the lever? Why, sir?
I just didn't think that morality is measured in numbers or numbers of lives.
Right. So what we have here really is utilitarianism and Immanuel Kant, that to cause death at any moment is wrong. All right. So we have reasonable positions here. Right? Would anyone be willing to shove the rotund man onto the track? Who would do that? So why are the numbers so much less now? Why do we only have 4 or 5 hands up instead of we had about 70 hands up? It's still utilitarian, but why not? Yes, sir.
People feel more connected to this person who's right there,
Right.
rather than far away.
Outstanding. Something about the indirect cause and the direct cause. Old Brown's going to be all about that. Would anyone have jumped themselves onto that track? Okay. Would anyone have been willing to push a rotund person who was their husband, their father, their son, or their uncle? And I don't mean at a certain moment of conflict. I mean in general. Would you, sir? Sure. Okay. It becomes much closer. All right, those of you who weren't willing to push the man, if I told you it saved 1,000 lives, how many now would push the man? More hands go up. Our utilitarianism grows with the savings there.
If you believe it.
What's that?
If you believe it.
If you could guarantee it, right? You take a risk there, right? How about this? How many people got to the final question about the executive and his decision? Only a few. Right? Did anyone change your answer from no to yes in that question? A lot of folks did. All right, here's what I think are the takeaways with this and where we can see it relate to Old Brown. The first takeaway, means and ends. This is central to the analysis of John Brown. A second takeaway, I'd argue, is intention. We do not simply look at the result, but what we intend. A third, a concept of duty. And a final one, personal sacrifice. So now, on to Old Brown. This is without doubt the ubiquitous classic image of Old Brown. It is so amazing, right, that in 1974, Kansas depicts it on their cover. Merrill Peterson, in his famous book, At the John Brown Museum, a picture book displays it first, and then Kansas comes back with a follow-up album that's a little bit less clear, but the same image here. Take a look at the image. What do you see in it? What's the central symbol? We always look at visual images with the what's the central one, sir?
Crazed guy with a rifle.
Okay, some people said Mr. DiNardo, but okay, a crazed guy with a rifle. Very good. You have a man that appears insane, right? What is in his left hand, to your right? What's in his hand? The Bible, or for John Brown, truth.
I have to say,
Yeah.
forgive me, 1 minute.
Yeah.
I have to disagree with you. Mother Teresa
Yeah.
was doing what she did for her own immortal soul.
Correct. No doubt she did that. I think, though, we as a whole love her because of her willingness to personally sacrifice, right? That's why we see that some folks, even if they don't share her vision of salvation, can respect that element there, right? So we have truth in one hand, Alpha and Omega, and in the right hand, the other truth, the Beecher Bible. It's a little bit of Old Testament truth there. What else do you see in the image? Okay, right, larger than life. The tornado, what else? Two different flags. John Brown dies before the Civil War comes about, but this image depicts what he, according to some, caused the Civil War. All right, you've got the Confederate and the Union soldier. You have the battle over Kansas, and then you have this gentleman here, Frederick Douglass. That image of John Brown, this image of John Brown as a crazed man will stick in our memory. John Brown lived from 1800 to 1859. John Brown fathered 20 children, which might indeed make anyone a little bit less than sane. 7 of those children died before the age of 5. So, 2 eyes, by the way, so, wasn't all one. But that image comes to us amidst the middle 20th century. This film, the Santa Fe Trail, you might recognize Ronald Reagan, Errol Flynn. But look at the images of Raymond Massey, John Brown. Would you agree he's not stable here? Here. Most historians describe this film as bunk, as poor history. It depicts Lee and Jefferson Davis as noble defenders of liberty. It depicts slavery as solely a states' rights issue. It depicts abolitionists as less than stable, and John Brown himself as solely a madman. So that image, I think, sticks with us. The difficulty I have with this is this, gentlemen. My wife thought it was a woman. It is not. This is Governor Wise, the governor of Virginia. When John Brown was captured at Harpers Ferry, he would be interrogated. Governor Wise witnessed that interrogation and then asked a few questions at the end. I'm going to come to those later. But he went and told people, quote, "They are mistaken who take him to be a madman. He is a man of clear head, of courage, of simple ingenuousness, cool, collected, and indomitable." So we have Governor Wise saying he's a rational actor and praising him in many ways. That image of John Brown falls from grace during a period that we call Jim Crow, a period roughly from the 1870s to the movie Selma, the 1960s, a period in which the radical Republican view of racial equality got placed on a back burner for other issues, a period in which we accept the idea that black Americans may be less than white. It took a little bit of a bump upwards during the Civil Rights Movement, but generally it continued to be seen, the image of Brown continues to be seen as a deranged man, up until maybe the last 10 years. And maybe this new narrative is the one that will be the final narrative. In November, in the Atlantic magazine, professor of law from Harvard, sorry Todd, Kenneth Mack, gave this response to the question, who was the most underrated politician in American history? His answer was John Brown. Because what he did brought on the Civil War. So we're going to test this, we're going to look at this. But beyond Brown and his rational minds and whether he caused a Civil War, I think one of the things that we respect about Brown, if it's, say, sacrifice from Mother Teresa, it's his most famous and quoted concept here. Talk, 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 what we need is action. These men are all talk, what we need is action. And what's fascinating is almost 100 years after Brown died, almost 100 years after it, on December the 1st, 1955, those words echoed through the mind of none other than Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks recalled on that bus, she said it was a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. And her grandfather's repeated comment, talk, 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 what we need is action. So a man who used violence and initiated violence inspired what is considered to be the most important nonviolent revolution in American history. The world's a bit crazy itself. So if we go here, we understand this. Our image of the Civil War comes from this man, Ken Burns. Those of us old enough to have watched it on TV from the 1980s, this beautiful, beautiful series. And this historian, Shelby Foote, and one of the most amazing accents I've ever heard. In that series, Shelby Foote and Barbara Jean Fields have a debate about the cause of the Civil War. And Foote's argument is this, and I cannot achieve his accent, so I won't try. He says that the reason the war came was because we, as Americans, failed to do what our greatest asset was, and that was to compromise. I would suggest that John Brown would agree. He refused to compromise. And just maybe, we're better off. Now let's go to Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry sits today in current-day West Virginia. It comes together here, and I want to point out this place called the Kennedy Farm. In the middle of 1859, John Brown will take up residence at the Kennedy Farm, bring the 21 raiders, a few of his daughters, to help plan this, very secretive. And his plan is to attack the arsenal at Harpers Ferry to grab approximately, the thought was 100,000 weapons. All right. On October the 16th, he brings his men together and says that the raid is ready to go. That raid is going to come down on Harpers Ferry here. Now, it's nice. It looks just like our hometown of Pittsburgh here. You can see the mountains that, these are my photos. These come from online sources here. You can see the mountainous area here, or the hills. We have mountains, they have hills. And you can see the point here. Okay. The raid occurs, and at first it comes off perfectly. Things go really well. Seize the arsenal, cut the telegraph lines, grab a few hostages. All right. And then events quickly devolve from there. A train approaches the depot. A black man, a free black man named Hayward Shepherd, is alerted. And in an exchange that is still not agreed upon, this free black man becomes the first man to die in this raid. And we'll come back to Hayward Shepherd later in this presentation. Historians also don't understand why Brown let the train continue on. Regardless, events start to unfold, and local officials and local townsmen come out to challenge Brown and his raiding party. Men from the top in their barracks come down these stairs, and they meet Brown head on. And eventually Brown will hole up in what is known as Brown's Fort. This is reconstructed, recreated at the National Park at Harpers Ferry. By the 17th, this is not even a full day, at least 8 of Brown's men are dead. On the 18th, U.S. federal troops arrive, Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart. On the 18th, we're less than about 30 hours after the raid. Jeb Stuart goes up to the fort under white flag and gives Brown a note. Surrender, you'll survive, and we'll go from there. Brown refuses. The Marines charge the fort. One gentleman, one Marine, goes to stab Brown. Brown survives solely because of his brass belt buckle. If you look closely at the image of Curry, it's right there. All right? Indeed, a belt buckle changes global history. Because if Brown had died at that moment, there is no martyrdom to Brown. It doesn't happen. All right. Brown is taken, beaten a bit, and then will be brought to be interrogated. Southerners, they're understandably shocked and angry. They want vengeance against this madman, and they prepare for various other things, all right? They call out arms, they ban northern newspapers, they ostracize, they tar and feather a little bit. It's always a little fun to do that. And they act pretty, in my mind, rationally to this type of attack. All right. I think what surprises some is that the initial response of the North was as equally disappointed. Horace Greeley, perhaps the greatest newspaper editor of the day, and William Lloyd Garrison, the great activist, both decry him as misguided and a madman. So we get this. We get this idea. But the South will also make an argument. They argue, and we're going to examine this, that no slave revolted. And this is evidence in their mind that the African felt content in slavery. And thus, the only thing that's happening is radical Republicans, known as black Republicans, mucking things up. That the black Republican, the radical abolitionist, is causing problems. And the most dangerous one was William Henry Seward. They blame him specifically. He was famed for in 1850 a higher law speech, this radical concept that the Constitution, the highest positive law that we have, man-made law, is superseded by perhaps God or natural law, right? And then in 1858, the irrepressible conflict, which some Southerners believed was sort of the go signal to Brown. Worse, while Brown was being interrogated and questioned, a satchel is found at the Kennedy farm. And in that satchel, they discover maps of seven other states. This is now not the work of one individual. This is a clear conspiracy to wreak havoc throughout the South. And they discover the names of the Secret Six. Of these, some names might be known to some of you. This one, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, perhaps the most famous, a Unitarian minister, active in the Underground Railroad, willing to use principled violence, an officer in the Civil War, and a journalist afterwards. This man, Theodore Parker, I'm going to come back to, also a Unitarian minister, pretty famous because he was the one who gave us the first derivation of something that Dr. King made famous. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's Parker's first comment there. The other one is Gerrit Smith, multimillionaire, even in this day, that provided a large plot of land in a place called New Elba for Brown to create an interracial community. This guy was radical. All right. So the Secret Six and that discovery alarms us. While we're finding this, Brown is being interviewed. I'd like to read you the statement from the end of the interview, because I think this gives us a little hint at what Brown's going to do at the trial. After he's been interrogated, Governor Wise asked to speak to him. Wise: "Mr. Brown, the silver of your hair is reddened by the blood of crime, and you should eschew these hard illusions and think upon eternity." Right? Think about everlasting eternity. Brown quickly: "Governor, whether my tenure here shall be 15 months or 15 days or 15 hours, I am equally prepared to go. There is an eternity behind and an eternity before, and the little speck in the center, however long, is but comparatively a minute. The difference between your tenure and mine is trifling, and I want to therefore tell you to be prepared. I am prepared. You all have a heavy responsibility, and it behooves you to prepare more than it does me." Brown is very comfortable with his God. He's telling Governor Wise, you better set your account in order. On October the 27th, Brown was deemed mentally and physically capable of standing trial. And that trial begins immediately. 4 days later, October the 31st, the defense rests. This is not this 6-month trial, 4 days. They rested in part because they demonstrated Brown had not murdered anyone, and thus could not be guilty of the crime he was charged with, that of treason. On November the 2nd, the jury, after 45 minutes, finds him guilty and will eventually, he'll be sentenced to die 1 month later, December the 2nd, 1859. This was the courthouse in Charlestown, West Virginia, today, Virginia then, that he was tried in. On December the 1st, the day before his execution, Brown has his last meal with his wife. And on December the 2nd, in the mid-morning, he is led by, if one believes, the Charlestown, West Virginia Historical Society, because some people are doubting this, by this caisson, these were the shackles, the weapon that he had been caught with. And he literally was executed in the side yard of this house. It's one heck of a party thing to show. They've got a little stand there to show you where John Brown was executed, and according to historians, that's the spot. The house is currently on sale for $750,000 if any interested buyers are out there. And if you are instead, give it to the Historical Society, okay? Yes. So Brown is executed on the 2nd. Immediately, Republicans go into damage control. Lincoln hasn't been nominated yet, maybe considering it, right? Brown's no Republican, and you have failed. In fact, on the execution of Brown, Lincoln had said, "We cannot object." Nathaniel Hawthorne, nobody was more ever justly hanged before. The anger of the South and the concern about John Brown and the wanting to distance oneself from him has got to be understood in the second most famous incident of John Brown that happened before Harpers Ferry, the Pottawatomi Massacre. On the evening, the late night of May the 24th, 1856, John Brown and a series of raiders knock on the door of the home of a man named James Doyle. The wife, Mahala, answers the door, and in her testimony later remarks that Brown had an odd look on his face, and he said that if any man came between him and what he considered right, he would take his life as coolly as he would eat his breakfast. And the crew begins to butcher 3 of the Doyle men, arms cut off, heads sliced open, and Brown allegedly took his revolver and shot James Doyle in the head. They went to 2 other homes, executed 2 other people. 5 people executed in what is known as the Pottawatomi Massacre. Mahala Doyle. Perhaps we can understand her letter to John Brown while he was in prison in Charlestown 3 years later. Although vengeance is not mine, and she goes on, I confess to say I have gratitude that you had lost 2 sons. Maybe you might feel like I felt, right, when I lost my children. And then she tells him that the one surviving son plans to be at the hanging. She kind of hints that he wants to actually cut the cord. Doyle also says this, and you can't say it was to free the slaves, because we own none and never planned to. So we have this powerful image here. And now we have to think back to this. Pottawatomi. How many lean towards he was insane? It's brutal, cold-blooded murder. Fair enough. Here's a difficulty. The moment itself can't be decontextualized. The Doyles never owned slaves, but the Doyles did defend slavery. And the Doyles did harass free state people in Kansas. Is that enough to be butchered? They're not neutral, though. Early historian of Kansas history said, hitherto, before Pottawatomi, murder had been an exclusively Southern privilege. Brown's equalizing the scales of justice here. I want to jump ahead for a minute to tell you a view of something. Osawatomie, or Osawatomie. This incident that's going to occur in August, 4 months after Brown, 3 months after Pottawatomi. 21 years later, this is the end of a period known as Reconstruction. There's a group that comes together, 10,000 strong, to celebrate the Battle of Pottawatomi and to praise the leader, John Brown. Present at this, speaking in favor of Brown, was the senator from Kansas, the very first governor of Kansas in 1861, when Kansas came into this great union as a free state. Charles Robinson spoke. Here's what he said. The soul of John Brown was the inspiration of the Union armies in the Emancipation War, and it will be the inspiration of all men in the present and distant future who may revolt against tyranny and oppression. To the superficial observer, John Brown was a failure. So was Jesus of Nazareth. Both suffered ignominious death as traitors to the government. Yet one is now hailed as the Savior of the world from sin, and the other of a race from bondage. It's pretty high praise to be made analogous to Jesus. Within a few years, Charles Robinson regrets those words and becomes part of the burying the image of John Brown. That burying occurs in what is known as the lost cause. There's no argument the South lost the Civil War. But the South did make a great effort and in some ways won the meaning of the war. That occurs immediately about 3 years afterwards with the book The Lost Cause. It occurs knowing Thomas Nast in his famous cartoon that talks about a period worse than slavery, the period of lynching, of convict leasing. It occurs clearly in the most famous film of the day, The Birth of a Nation, in which D.W. Griffith presents the Klan as a heroic group saving white purity, and how it was so wrong and bad to give black people rights in the vote. But it also occurs down here, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. Confederates and Union men come together in what was called remembrance and reunion. Remembrance and reunion. Bringing it together. Not one black person there, despite 200,000 blacks fighting in that war. In fact, until about a decade ago, Gettysburg did not mention slavery at the battle site. We erased this idea from our memory. That image, right, of here comes together with a movement from the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of the Confederacy and some others that put up monuments throughout the South. It's impressive to see how many are there. To what are known as loyal slaves, the good darky, various offensive comments here. But there's a movement to make slavery a benign system. As one said, to demonstrate for future generations that we were best friends. This is the original, part of the original inscription to a monument to Hayward Shepherd, the free black man who died at Harpers Ferry. Starting in 1904, the Daughters of the Confederacy wanted to put a monument up at Harpers Ferry. In the name of these humble, innocent victims there were 2 guys that died, proposed servile insurrection, this boulder is set up by the sons and daughters of the South in loving memory of all those faithful Negroes who, under this temptation of Brown and subsequent years of war of invasion, so conducted themselves that no stain of violence was left upon their record as long as the old relationship remained. Be an inspiration to all, together with the descendants of the tens of thousands of once heathen Africans, faithfully instructed in the principles of Christianity, and though less known to fame, equally deserving of the eternal reward which is theirs. This movement, the committee, described slavery as, quote, their period of indenture and a period of racial apprenticeship. No logical person can accept that definition of slavery. That element helps shape some historians' views. What we see in the mid-20th century is that Alan, I won't read all the names, but historians called Brown ignorant, a religious fanatic, a brutal murderer, a terrible man, deranged, fanatical, a pitiful failure, obsessed, monomaniacal, psychologically unbalanced. All of that which we found here. Here's the final boulder. Harpers Ferry couldn't accept that offensive statement. So we have this monument. It still has, though, subsequent years of war conducted themselves that no stain was left upon a record. This is going to be dedicated December the 10th, 1931. And the woman who was reading the dedication leading the ceremony, spoke of the wonderful mammies that she had worked for her, and then spoke of the sacrifice of Hayward Shepherd, and those who would like him has suffered death rather than betray their masters to a false trust. It's a really powerful idea of what is right and what is not. Not surprisingly, W.B. Du Bois, the great black historian and activist, and the NAACP protested this. Du Bois tried to get another monument at Harpers Ferry placed next to this. 1932, this is what he wanted it to read. Here John Brown aimed at human slavery a blow that woke a guilty nation. Over his corpse marched 200,000 black soldiers and 4 million freedmen, singing, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. I'll let you decide which of the two is a more accurate vision of John Brown. The monument stayed without the NAACP counter. In 1976, Harpers Ferry, like much of our nation, went through a renovation for the bicentennial. People noticed the monument, and they said, we've had the civil rights movement. We've even had the Black Power movement. Maybe this is offensive. The renovation was completed in 1981. Monument is still there. Plywood over it. 1995, primarily with the assistance of a senator from North Carolina. Thank you, Jesse Helms. The monument came back out with an explanatory placard next to it, which I think is reasonable. I don't want to erase history. I want to understand it better. The monument itself, though, is not in its original place in the center thoroughfare of Harpers Ferry. You have to actually walk around a corner and about 20 feet up a slight hill. So it is tucked away a little bit. But that's the dominant image that we have of Brown, the crazed madman, etc. But we also have this counter-narrative, this oppositional narrative. And I contend that that narrative, John Brown died on December 2nd, and he was buried on December 9th in North Elba. But his words last, and they march on. So Brown transforms at his trial. I'd like to read you part of what he said to the court. I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and the weakest. I deny everything but what I have admitted, that I have worked on behalf of freeing the enslaved. He contends that he did not intend violence, and I'll explain that in a bit, what he thought could happen. But I love this next line. He goes on for a few sentences. It says, had I interfered on behalf of the rich, the powerful, the influential, I would be here being praised, not condemned. He finishes, now if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, I submit, so let it be done. In the period before his execution, his conduct itself started to transform Northerners. October 30th, the trial is going on, his defense has not rested. Wendell Phillips, John Brown has loosened the roots of the slave system. It only breathes, it does not live. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him the new saint who will make the gallows as glorious like the cross. Thoreau, I wish I could say that Brown was the representative of the North, but he was a superior man. No man in America ever stood up so persistently and effectively for the dignity of human nature. And then with his execution, December the 2nd. William Lloyd Garrison, this beautiful pacifist who had condemned John Brown, on his execution day in Tremont Temple in Boston, if you know it, it's a sacred ground. Today, Virginia has murdered John Brown. Tonight, we here witness his resurrection. Even the great apostle of nonviolence praises old Brown. Louise May Alcott, living he made life beautiful, dying made life death divine. Thoreau again in a lengthy eulogy that I just give you one line from. It seems no man had ever died in America before, for in order to die, you must first have lived. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The 2nd of December, 1859, the date of the new revolution, quite as much needed as the old one. And then we see monuments to Brown. This is his burial place in North Elba. Throughout the country, from Ohio through Massachusetts, through parts of the north, you see all these monuments. This one I especially love, of Brown with a young African-American a boy. We see the counter-narrative growing. But the invention, perhaps, of this narrative is most connected to one image, the kiss. So let's look at this one now, if you can, from the back. Brown is still bearded. Brown was clean-shaven, kind of like Nick here, all his life until 2 years before Harpers Ferry, when he grew the beard as a disguise. Is there anything different in this beard than in the first beard you saw, the Curry painting? It's well-groomed, well-groomed, great. What else do you see in the painting by Currier and Ives here? What does it appear as above, Jim? Yeah, it's bingo. It's the Virginia flag, Sic Semper Tyrannis, right? Thus always the tyrants, but it creates it as a halo. Great. What else do you see?
Bottom left corner, the lady is blindfolded and holding the...
Okay, who is that lady who's blindfolded? Except her arm's broken. All right, it's harder to see for you, but justice is broken. And folks, what's the analogy here? Yeah, the Madonna on the way. Who? Yes. Yes. So what you're having here, how can we now take this to be essentially Christ on the way to his execution? It's the year, it's the year, it's the year. 1863.
Why is that fierce Russian?
Okay, it is wonderful to see the guards. This guard appears like he's pushing him along. There's no clear understanding of that person. I don't know. That's a great question. Right. A little color, all right? So, you know, it's young Putin. I don't know. All right. 1863. January the 1st, 1863. Emancipation Proclamation. Despite what some people will say today, the Civil War was and always will be about slavery. But only with January 1st was it about abolition. Now, Brown's efforts become part of this heroic new struggle. Brown was not alone in this. Brown was not, this painting came out of a poem. John Greenleaf Whittier was considered the most prominent abolitionist poet, a Quaker, a guy who actually disagreed with Brown, thought it was a folly to attack Harpers Ferry, but really evokes and gives us something powerful. And it's a longer poem, but hear this line: "Let some poor slave mother whom I have striven to free, with her children from the gallows stare, put a prayer for me, as he stooped between the jeering ranks and kissed the Negro's child." You can see here, he's going to bend down to kiss the woman and her child, the slave woman and her child. A famed abolitionist, Lydia Maria Child, wrote a poem similarly, and a few others. After the war, you know, knockoffs, if you will, similar images of Brown and this scene here. It's all a myth. It never occurred. It comes from a New York Tribune article. That article was written from New York, not from Charlestown. Secondhand accounts. Brown had a kindly jailer, denied that it ever happened. But most importantly, I went through it quickly, but when I showed you the photos I took from the execution of John Brown in the museum, there was a placard. All people were removed from the streets. For 2 days, all black people were denied the right to be on the streets. There was going to be no martyrdom of John Brown in Charlestown. And what slave state, if you're executing a man for insurrection and treason, would allow any slave to come near that man? It's an invention of meaning, but it's one heck of a powerful one. So if we move from there to take a look at these contested meanings and now the greater realities here. David Blight, great historian from Yale, argues this. John Brown's plan was not absurd, and I'll demonstrate that, I hope, later. Secondly, he argued that there were very few people that could match the level of egalitarianism. He argues there was no shred of racism in John Brown. My students will tell you, I adore Lincoln. We can't say the same about him. All right? John Brown was unique there. Thirdly, John Brown, if I can steal from Rick Warren, lived a purpose-driven life. All right? This was not uncommon in antebellum America. There was a great movement, the Second Great Awakening, in which people were trying to right themselves personally and with society. Reconsider how we engage the material world. That movement spawned moral suasion as the effort to end slavery. But while that's happening, a large block of people get frustrated with the slow pace of moral suasion. It's not working. So you see a growing militancy. John Brown saw himself as a warrior for God, a man who would be willing to act more directly. He had seen as a child a 12-year-old enslaved person beaten that stayed with him, and he consecrates his life to the destruction of slavery. Brown himself wasn't alone in doing this, but he is a challenge to someone. This is one of my favorite people in history. William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison in 1831 was the radical voice, called for immediate end to slavery, no compensation, equal rights for blacks, equal rights for women. We don't even have that with a lot of people in the 21st century. Garrison's there, and all nonviolently. Garrison would be nearly lynched in Boston, right? One of the centers of freedom. Why? He viewed the Constitution as a slave document, and he burned it. He's challenging this one. This is talk, talk, talk. What we need is action. Not alone, though. Joshua Giddings, representative from Ohio. In 1842, Joshua Giddings violates congressional procedure. We had a gag rule. You can't bring up issues of slavery. Joshua Giddings spoke about something called the Creole Rebellion. How many have heard of the Amistad? The Creole is less known. The Creole slaves were legally enslaved. The Amistad Africans were not legally enslaved. They had the legal right to rebel. The Creole slaves were legally enslaved. They rebelled, and they got to Nassau in the Bahamas and their freedom. Joshua Giddings introduces resolutions into Congress calling their actions just. Violent actions to white owners. The death of whites was justified. His congressional colleagues censure him and dismiss him from Congress. He's expelled. His home district in a special election re-elects him by a 97% of the vote. Henry Highland Garnett, a black minister who spent a couple of years after the Civil War on Pittsburgh's North Side. In 1843, he speaks to a black audience in Buffalo, New York, and speaks to 4 million enslaved people, rise up, let your motto be rebellion. Pretty militant. Frederick Douglass is there. After Garnett speaks for about an hour and a half, Douglass takes the stand and says, yo, people, chill out. Garnett, after half an hour, takes a stand and says to Douglass. The convention did not accept Garnett's call and resolution. John Brown printed it, along with David Walker's appeal to black people. This is his plan, the subterranean pathway. John Brown started to think about this plan for Harpers Ferry in the early 1840s. It's not a spur-of-the-moment thing. It's something he thought out. This image is the sole image we have. We don't guarantee this is the flag that we think it is, but flags like this had SPW on it, and some people claim they see the SPW in it. We believe that this is part of what he called the subterranean pathway. It was going to be a massive underground railroad. John Brown had worked on the Underground Railroad. What he wanted was not the removal of 2 or 3 at a time, but to create a sieve, a constant flow. So the first time he met Frederick Douglass in Springfield, Massachusetts, he spoke to Douglass about the mountains. He had had experience in the mountains. He said they're full of these beautiful natural forts. They're good hiding places. They would allow me to baffle and elude anyone, right? I know these mountains well and could take a body of men into them and keep them there in spite of all the efforts of Virginia to dislodge me. The plan was this: get 25 guys, about the size of the Harpers Ferry party, and organize them in cells. It's scary in the 21st century to hear this, right? And then these cells would attack plantations, seize a number of slaves, and bring them into the Appalachian Mountains. And some would get to freedom in the North and in Canada, and some would stay in interracial communities and grow this rebellion in the hills of the Appalachians. Arming black men would give them confidence, and the constant assault on plantations would weaken the slave economy, and in Brown's words, would terrorize them. And eventually, this would break, right? Brown actually studied other examples, studied the rebellion of Nat Turner, studied the Seminole War, studied the Portuguese guerrilla fighters challenging domination, and met with a guy named Hugh Forbes at Elba, at New Elba, a guy who worked with Garibaldi in guerrilla warfare in Italy. Brown's not making this up on his own. He's drawing on evidence. In 1850, the United States Congress passes a restrictive Fugitive Slave Act. The prior one, Northerners ignored. This one imposes serious fines, penalties, and burdens on white or black allies to liberation, right? I'm not going to right now worry about the white response. Black communities in Syracuse, in Ohio, promised they'll take scalps and they'll kill. Frederick Douglass, who had 7 years earlier said, chill, writes, 2 or 3 dead slaveholders will make this law a dead letter. Douglass has transformed. He's willing to use principled violence. This law, there is no free black person in America. Douglass, 2 years later, writes his only work of fiction, a little novella, The Heroic Slave. What's the most famous novel from 1852? Uncle Tom's Cabin. Douglass praised it. But for Douglass, Tom deferred. The noble, the heroic slave, was Madison Washington, the leader of the Creole Rebellion. Theodore Parker, the gentleman I told you about. In September of 1850, I told you about that, he gives us a sense of duty here. Let us look a little at our duty under this statute, under this law. If a man falls into the water and is in danger of drowning, it is the natural duty of the bystanders to aid in pulling him out, even at the risk of wetting their garments. How many would agree with that? Yes, he goes on to say, you'd be a coward if not. Then he asks that if a troop of wolves or tigers attack somebody, you still are responsible for assisting even at your own peril. Then he says, if a man comes to shoot another man or harm another man, you are duty-bound to aid. And his final reflection goes, but suppose the invader who seizes the man is an officer of the United States, a commission in his pocket and a warrant in his hand. Does that give him any more natural right to enslave a man than he had before? And the beautiful line, can any piece of parchment make right wrong and wrong right? This concept of duty may complicate our ethical discussion earlier. Henry David Thoreau in 1854, in response to a return of one fugitive, said, my thoughts turn to murder toward the state. Talk. 1851, 3.5 hours from here, people acted out. Christiana, Pennsylvania. It's a beautiful site. It's now owned by some Amish, a beautiful farm. This gentleman, Edward Gorsuch, was a slave owner, came to retrieve legally a few of his slaves who had left Maryland and gotten there. A guy named William Parker was in this house. This is not him. This is from 1890. Lived in this house, himself a fugitive. This is the first incident that we know of in American history where a slave owner was intentionally killed in a legal act to retrieve slaves. 39 people, whites and blacks, are put on trial for treason. We're saying to resist the Fugitive Slave Act, to assist people to freedom, is a crime against this nation. Now we get to Kansas. Some of you know the basics of Kansas, so I will quickly do this. What I want you to know here, right, that Brown is not isolated. Brown is engaged in a large growing militant movement, and all before Kansas begins. Brown will begin his planning, and in early 1855, 5,000 what are known as border ruffians, folks from Missouri that come into Kansas. As a quick thing, Stephen Douglas, Kansas-Nebraska Act, set up the idea that popular sovereignty. Everybody says America's about democracy. You vote whether you're slave or free. Everybody says, yay, that's good. Except this, that Kansas was above something called the 3630 line, the southern border of Missouri. That had been the agreement. Everything above that line, except Missouri, would be free. Everything below that line would be slave. If you're an anti-slavery person, this new law gave the South a chance to get another slave state. And it's absolutely unacceptable. Even Lincoln would say, you can't let it expand an inch. I can't destroy it where it exists, but I don't have to allow it to spread. So border ruffians come in and they abuse free state people. The violence starts with the border ruffians. And they're outnumbered, they're outgunned if you're a free state person. President Pierce, a year later or so, says this, that there was a deliberate plan to force slavery upon the people of Kansas despite the law. Like hundreds of others, 5 of Brown's children come to Kansas, but Brown did not. They later write him and say, we're in desperate need. Send us Beecher's Bibles, guns. He arrives in Kansas on October the 6th, 1855. Pottawatomi, when was it? May 24th, 1856. 4 free state people, at least 4, are directly murdered by pro-slavery people. These dates here. This gentleman here, his limbs were hacked and his body was dumped on an icy front porch. Brown's not the first brutal man in Kansas. Free state people abused here. The sack of Kansas, 800 men come in with signs, Southern rights, supremacy of the white race. 1, perhaps 2 free state men are killed here. This is the incident that Charles Sumner spoke to and was beaten over the head, bloodied, choking on his own blood in his Senate chamber there. All of this happens. And prior to Pottawatomi, 200 people killed, the vast majority free state people. After Pottawatomi, John Brown is a wanted man. There's a manhunt that is massive for him. He goes into guerrilla warfare mode. A week later, he initiates attack at a place in Prairie City, Blackjack. That attack leads to some death and 2 of Brown's sons who were not involved in this being brutally beaten. Bounties are put out on him. The governor of Missouri puts out a $3,000 bounty. President Buchanan puts out a $250 bounty. Brown himself puts out a $2.50 bounty on Buchanan. And then the moment at Osawatomie. In August at Osawatomie, Brown brings in 30 men to try and free this place. 5 of Brown's men are killed, including one of his sons. And Brown weeps as he holds him and recognizes that he has but one life to live and that he will die very soon for the cause of ending slavery. About a year later, he's in Tabor, Iowa, with Hugh Forbes, guerrilla training. He's here preparing Harpers Ferry. He then returns to Massachusetts. He's wanted in Kansas. He speaks before the state legislature in Massachusetts. He has lunch with Emerson and has a poetry reading with Thoreau. It's the limousine liberals here, right? Here we have the real activist, and we'll just celebrate him here. Goes to Ontario, and in Ontario sets up a beautiful constitution, interracial justice, establishes an interracial school. Pennsylvania still had segregated ones. He's acting wonderfully here. He organizes with the Secret Six. May the 19th of 1858 in Kansas, There's a brutal attack by pro-slavery people. 11 people, businessmen and ministers, are taken to a ravine and shot and buried in that ravine. Brown comes back December, goes into Missouri, maybe 10 miles into Missouri, seizes 11 enslaved people, gets them hundreds of miles to Canada, evading 60 U.S. military troops. In Canada, 12 people are freed. One of the women was pregnant. 12 people are freed. What does this represent? The subterranean pathway works. This is, in his mind, absolute proof that the plan can work. In fact, a document, Old Brown's Parallels, on the back of it, he writes the safe houses. It's his AAA guide here. Go here, you'll get help. Go here, this is good. They will assist you. He's advertising how to do this. The plan's potential. I think I have established the idea that the plan had potential. I think I've addressed this concept of conspiracies. Guilty. Brown was in a conspiracy. The Secret Six was investigated by the U.S. Senate. The results were less than satisfying for Southerners, and they dismissed them without guilt, though there was a minority report otherwise. There was another group called the Black Strings. These are white men called the Black Strings. They wore black strings around their lapel here. They were based in Ohio, ready to whisk away anybody who would be grabbed to give testimony against Brown. There's conspiracies all around. But if we go beyond that to further realities here, actors, aides, and allies, let me examine the Southern contention that black people didn't respond to Brown, because that's one of the central claims of the South. 5 black men went on the raid. Lewis Sheridan Leary died at Harpers Ferry, though he survived for 8 hours. The most famous one was Dangerfield Newby. Dangerfield Newby had a very personal reason for going on this raid. In his pocket was found this letter. Newby was enslaved and then freed by his white Scottish father, but his wife and 6 children were still enslaved. He had made an agreement with their master to purchase their freedom for $1,500, and he raised that. And then the master reneged. And the wife begs of him to come and get her. Newby is the first of the raiders to die. A 6-inch spike shot out, ripped his throat from ear to ear. Southerners pounced on him, or Virginians pounced on him with these rusty knives and dig into him, and then let him wallow as wild hogs eat at him. The other gentlemen, Shields Green and John Anthony Copeland, survived, arrested, and executed. The only one to escape was Osborne Perry Anderson, and he would give a personal account, then die in 1872. Beyond Harpers Ferry, aid that was given. Prior to the attack, Brown had much help from the black community. An AME church in Harpers Ferry helped plan the assault. A series of black armed militias that formed, 4 or 5 of them from Philadelphia through Ohio, worked with him plotting to assist. He had his own called the League of Gileadites, 44 men. These ones had between 100 and 200. They were going to assist, but a huge communication problem. Most of these groups thought the raid would be October 24th. It was October 16th. So that failed. A handful of blacks in the area participated spontaneously. Historians estimate only between 7 and 17, but some did. Some actually fired weapons at Harpers Ferry. And then after the raid, Virginia authorities complain about blacks setting fire to various properties, including 3 of the men who served on the jury. So I'm not sure that black people were not interested. Beyond that, Henry Highland Garnett gives a beautiful sermon. Frederick Douglass, 1 year after his death, Frederick Douglass in Tremont Temple. How shall American slavery be abolished? The John Brown way. A mob forced him out of that temple. Wasn't yet okay to praise Brown. Du Bois, Du Bois gives us this beautiful line. Brown taught us the cheapest price to pay for liberty is its cost today. On the 50th anniversary of his death, happened to be the second annual gathering of the NAACP, Du Bois decided to meet with the NAACP at Harpers Ferry. And the contingency walks barefoot to the spot on which he was hanged. Called Brown, quote, the incarnate spirit of justice. Here we are on the scene of Brown's martyrdom. We reconsecrate ourselves, our honor, and our posterity to the final emancipation of our race, which John Brown died to make free. Jesus Christ came not to bring peace, but a sword. So did John Brown. Jesus Christ gave his life as a sacrifice for the lowly. So did John Brown. Merrill Peterson describes this meeting as the critical juncture for black Americans. But let me add one last black voice, the great poet. Langston Hughes. Beautiful poet, right? He wrote two poems about Harpers Ferry. Just give you a small excerpt of one. October the 16th. Why is that date important? It's the date that Harpers Ferry started, the 16th. Perhaps you will remember John Brown, who died for your sake. But now the total from his other poem, Shame on You. If you're great enough and clear enough, the government might honor you. But the people will forget, except on holidays. A movie house in Harlem named after Lincoln. Nothing at all named after John Brown. Black people don't remember any better than white. If you're not alive and kicking, shame on you. Langston Hughes had a very personal connection to John Brown. Hughes's grandfather was a man named Charles Langston, who worked on the Oberlin, Ohio Underground Railroad, was arrested in a famous 1858 raid that freed a man named John Price. His grandfather established the first school for black people in Kansas, moved back to Ohio, and married a woman named Mary Patterson Leary. Hughes's grandmother and a great influence on his life. Leary's first husband was Sheridan Lewis Leary, the gentleman who died at Harpers Ferry. And according to Matt Pinsker at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Langston Hughes was swaddled in the blood-stained blanket that Leary died on. This is very personal for Langston Hughes. So if we will, what do we make of Brown? Frederick Douglass argued that John Brown began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Du Bois Review, Southern Journal at the time, agreed. I'm going to argue this. John Brown, without him, I don't know if we have the Civil War. Without John Brown, I think Seward gets nominated. If Seward's nominated, he doesn't win. Maybe he wins. If he wins, he was willing to compromise with the Crittenden Compromise. We needed Lincoln. Don't get Lincoln without John Brown. He, in my mind, to steal from James McPherson, is the sine qua non of the Civil War. David Blight argues that we should pardon John Brown. It would help seal things. But if we pardon John Brown, I will finish with these questions. Do we need to pardon Timothy McVeigh? If we pardon John Brown, do we need to pardon Scott Roeder, who killed the abortion doctor George Tiller and used a necessary defense argument? To a great degree, then, I suspect that John Brown is like what was said about Hayward Shepherd, an ever-present bone of contention. But I ask one thing. One of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, in his little book called The Fire Next Time, right? God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time, suggested that if we want to avoid that fate, then we, like lovers, the relatively conscious few, white and black, must come together to save this nation and to be what we can be. I'd argue this, that John Brown, if nothing else, was relatively conscious. I'd also argue that the violence of the age, and especially the violence of slavery, was incredibly insane. incredibly mad, and incredibly unacceptable. So if you must judge John Brown, please judge him in that context. And we go there then to ask you, what should we teach our children about John Brown? Traitor? Terrorist? Freedom fighter? Frederick Douglass asked us to do this. Go teach your children about him. Du Bois said he was the eternal truth. What do you think? Let me hear your views. A zealot? For good or bad? More good than bad? All good? Okay. Oh, fair enough. Certainly not me. Do you think he was ethical? To a degree, great. Right? David Blight made an argument that we should celebrate December 2nd. We should hold that date in reverence. Should we toll a bell every December 2nd? Show of hands, how many say yes? We might get people to talk, right?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How much coercion did he place on his children to participate with him?
It's a great question. I had in this book, you can see how long I went. The question was about coercion in his children. John Brown, John Jr. survived. He didn't go on he survived until 1895. And a lot of what we know about John Brown as a father comes from John Jr., all right? And he's both described as a wonderful and loving man, right? And a tender man. So the song that you played, that I played, you may not have heard, flip to the other side of the yellow page, Pretty Little Bird. It's a story about John Brown and his daughter at the Kennedy farm. And the daughter comes in saying that, I hear these birds in distress. Papa, come and find this. Help me, right? Brown goes and discovers that there's a snake ready to eat the birds. So he takes a shovel and kills the snake. Fair enough. Then he reads that into a sign from God to do this larger thing. This is the permission from God to go. All right. Brown's relationship with his children had that element and one of severe discipline. At Harpers Ferry, I believe it was Oliver was dying and wanted to be released from his pain. Shoot me dead now. Brown told him, die like a man. Brown made his one son keep a record book of offenses. And each offense, and I can't remember what each one was worth, but for doing X, 8 lashes. For doing Y, 3 lashes. This one, 4 lashes. And the time came for the account to be settled. And the kid is saying, so I, shirt off, and old Brown gets about a third of the way through the whipping. He stops. The old man, it was John Jr., the old man kneels with his shirt off and orders the son to finish the whipping on him because the failure of his son was in large part the failure of the father. And the son begins to whip, and Brown goes harder, harder, until blood came. So coercion to go was not there. On the trip, we tend to think that John Brown, when a zealot, was an evangelical in the pejorative sense of that, not in the positive sense, right? The folks who came on the trip, John Kaji, who was with him, was a humanist. So it wasn't only those who were dedicated because of their understanding of faith. There were folks who were, rationalists that said justice and duty. So I don't know if coercion, but a lot of parenting that I wouldn't use. Yeah.
In the National Park Service Center in Corinth, Mississippi, there's a monument in the courtyard that shows the timeline of our country. And it's one of my favorite spots. It says that the United States of today is the United States formed by the Civil War, not the United States formed by the Revolution.
Right.
Slavery was unacceptable to our way of thinking, and it had to be done. And things had been fermenting for so long, it took someone like Brown to light the match.
I think that there's reasonable argument to suggest that, and that the sort of utilitarian argument about the justness of that. I guess where we struggle with is, I think most people don't struggle as much with Harpers Ferry. They struggle with Pottawatomi. And so what I was trying to do was suggest that there was a boatload of violence that you can't judge Pottawatomi on without saying that. Doesn't mean that you have to. I don't know if I can jump on board with severing limbs, right? I just don't know. I mean, there's times some of these kids make me want to do that. But there is, I just don't know if I can do that. That's where I think we struggle with, right? Even if you had felt this James Doyle was so much part of the problem. I mean, that's what Thoreau's comment is. Thoreau, when he made that statement, my thoughts turned to murder towards the state, was speaking in front of 600 white liberals in Framingham, Massachusetts, who were angry about this thing called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. How dare they take this? And yet, right in their backyard, Anthony Burns, a black man, they allowed him to be taken back into slavery. And he's telling them, right? He is so disgusted he can't take a nice walk anymore. He's going through all this stuff, right? Now, Thoreau didn't go down to Kansas himself, but he at least was speaking truth in this moment. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
Well, this is probably historical fiction, but The Good Lord Bird, I just read it, and
I've not read it.
Very entertaining.
Okay, yeah.
But I think in that book, the Doyles played a bigger, I may recollect that they were responsible for the death of Fred, one of Brown's sons.
I've not come, it may be.
Not
Right.
that that's okay. They played a bigger part.
Right. Yeah, I agree that, as I said, they're not neutral and that there's some element there. So her claim is accurate. They didn't own slaves and didn't plan to. But that's not the total story and total truth.
What other ways did W.E.B. Du Bois foster his opinion of all of this?
Yeah. Well, he was the one that not only in 1909, but with the monument challenged this. So part else of what Du Bois spoke about there, and I had removed it, but some people have the idea that crucifixion consists in the punishment of an innocent man. The essence of crucifixion is that men are killing a criminal, that men have got to kill him. And yet the act of crucifying him is the salvation of the world. John Brown broke the law. He killed human beings. Those people who defended slavery had to execute John Brown, although they knew that in killing him, they were committing the greater crime. It is out of that human paradox that there comes crucifixion. What I think is this, that Du Bois helps what Peterson argues. That moment of 1909 helps us. I think it's easy to see that the black community was much more comfortable seeing Brown as a hero. The white community has gone through many more derivations, and we could say that probably on a lot of things.
W.E.B. Du Bois lived half a mile from Rod's house in Barrington, Massachusetts.
That is fascinating, but right. I mean, well, he went to Ghana long before, yeah.
Right, and the house is gone, but there's a park, and you walk through this pathway and look down into the foundation.
Can I ask this? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Wes brought two things.
Drum.
Totally deceptive.
Yeah.
You didn't mention Oliver Cromwell, but I believe that he was one of Brown's biggest heroes. Let me just throw
Okay.
you far
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
One of the people that Brown trusted probably incorrectly was John Cook.
Yeah.
And maybe you could comment on this too.
Yeah, and I don't have enough to speak on it. You can tell us more that you know, because I don't know the views that you said about Cromwell and the specifics with Cook. So I concede lack of knowledge there. All right. Sir.
What about Michael Foucault and his
Yeah.
idea of punishment?
Yeah. I don't think the state of Virginia had any other option, right?
I think Brown,
Yeah.
from himself,
Yeah.
his view of what he
Yeah.
had to do to dismember
Yeah.
people. And
So in a fairly radical way, we can see it as a rational act that sets things right, I guess, right? Yeah. I just don't know if I can. I just have trouble going to that one there, right? I mean, I can rationally hear you. I just can't accept that fully.
Talked a lot about examples where militancy helps exacerbate or accelerate
Mhm.
change. And you can see that from afar.
Yeah.
When you're right there, when the militancy is happening.
Yeah.
A lot of people are more apt to distance themselves
Yeah.
from it.
Yeah.
Are there examples that you know of where the militancy actually helped kill the cause versus speed it up?
Oh, certainly. I think that the backlash effect. I mean, that's one argument that says, when we look at nation building as a state, we nation built the South for a decade after the Civil War. We occupied it in a militant way that had a big backlash. That some would argue, was it the failure that we left in 1877 or that we were that firm? Personally, when Grant uses law and military to destroy the Klan, I'm okay with that. But I can see that backlash there. I would argue that when we look at that second one, there's a lot of concern within the dominant culture about black power and black militancy in the 60s. I think what's interesting is that we had this, about 7 years ago, I took about 10 kids to see Cornel West speak down at Pitt. At about this time of the year, their Black Action Society puts on a great talk every year. So it was a great thing for these kids to experience, about 700 African Americans and me and 9 white Mount Lebanon kids. And he spoke for 3 hours straight without a script. It was a sermon. But what he discussed too was, number one, the sanctification of King, but also this idea that we idolize King, and I do. But we put him up as the model. But we also wage violent war. And how do we make sense of that when we do that? And we all will do this, right? I mean, how many went to see Zero Dark 30? Right? And how many may go see American Sniper if you haven't seen it? So we get attracted to this, but we also say King's the way. I think we're in this torn paradox that we want that way, but we also feel that this is just at times, or at least acceptable. So the backlash, I think, does occur, but I think we're more internally torn about which one to go with. Can I ask you, the song, Magpie, this group produced this CD in the year 2000. Does anybody think it's odd that a group writes an entire CD dedicated to John Brown at the millennium? I mean, I love folk music, so I enjoy I play it just for entertainment, but not just for class. But it is interesting. This group came out of the civil rights movement. I have some of their songs in another one. It's interesting. All right. Any final questions? Yes.
May I have your attention, please? The computers will shut down at 10 minutes to 9.
Yeah.
You must have all your documents printed by that time. Thank you.
So the question is that if we didn't go to civil war, when would slavery have ended and become obsolete? Generally this, at the founding, most people who were anti-slavery, and someone later like Lincoln, felt that slavery would die a natural death, exactly what you said. But the way that that had to be done was to contain it. And that's why Lincoln's position was containment, don't let it grow, to almost gain new strength with that. It's a parallel to like a Harry Potter concept, all right? But if you keep it contained. Lincoln dealt with a possible plan to allow it to exist for another, some estimate 50, some say 100 years. The South, I think, made the wrong play. The South could have accepted compromises. They didn't. And what they got was, within 4 years, the immediate uncompensated end to slavery. Exactly what they refused to even consider. They could have bargained a better deal, and we would have accepted it. The North would have rather avoid war and accepted that continuation there. Don't know if it naturally would have died that quickly, though.
It really didn't die.
Well, right. I mean, the argument says that slavery by another name, whether it's lynching, convict leasing, or some would continue on to the current imprisonment. We could argue that it happens, yeah. But at least legally, it ended. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Enjoy your evening.